The chandeliers of the Grand Astoria ballroom did not illuminate. They interrogated. Each of the 10,000 crystals hanging from the vaulted ceiling was a sharp, accusatory eye, casting long, skeletal shadows across the damask-draped tables. It was a room built for judgment, where the clinking of champagne flutes sounded like the cocking of hammers, and the low murmur of the city's elite was a verdict waiting to be delivered. This was the suffocating opulence of the annual Civic Benefactors Gala, and tonight, its brightest, most merciless spotlight was fixed on Samuel Washington. At 72, Samuel wore his dignity like a well-tailored suit. His tuxedo was classic, his posture erect, a relic from a time when a man's bearing was his bond. He stood on the polished dais, a heavy crystal award in his hands, its facets catching the light and fracturing it into 1,000 pieces. Much like his life was about to be. The award was for lifetime achievement in community service, a recognition of decades spent building youth centers, funding scholarships, and quietly mentoring generations of young men and women in the city's forgotten corners. The applause was a polite, rolling thunder that did little to warm the cavernous room. Samuel offered a humble, grateful nod, his face a mask of serene composure. He adjusted the microphone, the metallic click echoing in the sudden silence. "Thank you," he began, his voice a low, steady baritone that had calmed anxious boardrooms and reassured frightened children. A man is measured not by what he accumulates, but by what he gives back. I have only tried to be a good steward of the opportunities this city has given me. As he spoke, a figure detached himself from the head table and moved toward the stage with the predatory grace of a panther. Bradley Morrison, real estate tycoon and the city's reigning philanthropist king, ascended the steps. He was a man sculpted from success, with a smile as bright and hard as a diamond, and eyes that held the cold, transactional glint of a born conqueror. He was charismatic, beloved, and tonight, he was the event's chairman. "Allow me to add my own congratulations," Morrison said, his voice smooth as aged whiskey, amplified by the microphone he gently took from Samuel's hand. He placed a familiar, proprietary hand on Samuel's shoulder. The room relaxed, anticipating a laudatory tribute. Samuel Washington is, indeed, a pillar of our community, a testament to resilience. The word hung in the air, weighted with an unspoken meaning that only a few in the room seemed to catch. A subtle shift occurred, a tightening in the atmosphere. "It's truly wonderful to see you enjoying a life of such peace, Samuel," Morrison continued, his smile never faltering, "especially after everything your family, and others, went through. Some people, it seems, are just born with the ability to move on from history, to put the past, no matter how complicated, firmly behind them." It was a masterclass in smiling assassination. Morrison's words were a filigree of politeness wrapped around a core of pure poison. He used no slurs, made no direct accusations. He didn't need to. The coded references to a long-buried misfortune, a complicated past, were enough. He was painting Samuel not as a philanthropist, but as a survivor of a scandal, a man whose honor was built on a foundation of forgotten tragedy. He was casting doubt, planting seeds of suspicion in the fertile minds of the city's elite. Samuel did not flinch. He did not recoil from Morrison's touch. His expression remained one of unnerving calm, his dark eyes fixed on Morrison's, unwavering. He stood with the stillness of a mountain, enduring the subtle erosion of his character with a dignity that was almost unnerving in his placid exterior. A question formed in the minds of those watching. What was he thinking? What was this man? A man of such profound honor, capable of when that honor was so publicly and exquisitely defiled. Morrison gave Samuel's shoulder a final, patronizing squeeze. An inspiration to us all. Let's hear it again, for Samuel Washington. The applause that followed was hesitant, confused. The poison had done its work. The air was thick with questions, whispers already starting to snake between the tables. Samuel descended the steps, the heavy award feeling like an anchor in his hand. He navigated the room with the same deliberate grace, his head held high, acknowledging the strained smiles and averted gazes. He was a ghost at his own celebration. He knew this wasn't about an old grudge. It was a declaration of war. Bradley Morrison hadn't just insulted him. He had exhumed a ghost, a shared, tragic history that Samuel had spent a lifetime trying to honor with good works. Morrison's attack wasn't random. It was the opening salvo in a battle for the soul of the city, and, more importantly, for the truth of the past. As Samuel reached his solitary table, he placed the award down with a soft, definitive click. He smoothed the front of his tuxedo jacket and adjusted his cufflinks with a precise, deliberate motion. It wasn't an act of vanity. It was an act of centering himself, of preparing for what was to come. This was not about revenge. It was about restoration. This was about dignity, and for his dignity. Samuel Washington would burn the world to the ground. Samuel Washington's home was a quiet rebellion against the world Bradley Morrison inhabited. It was a modest but immaculate brownstone on a tree-lined street in a neighborhood that had resisted the relentless march of gentrification. Where Morrison's world was one of glass towers and sterile opulence, Samuel's was one of worn leather armchairs, the scent of old books and lemon oil, and walls lined with photographs that chronicled a life of service, not of acquisition. There were pictures of him in a crisp army uniform, his face young and determined, a faded photo of his late wife, Eleanor, her smile a beacon of warmth, and dozens of snapshots of community children, now grown, their graduations and weddings a testament to his influence. His life was a tapestry of quiet routines. Mornings were for coffee, the newspaper, and tending the small garden in his backyard. Afternoons were for his work with the foundation, reading grant proposals and making calls from the dignified solitude of his study. It was a life of purpose, deliberately curated to keep the ghosts of the past at bay. The ghost that Morrison had so casually invoked at the gala was the Northwood Mill. Decades ago, it had been the lifeblood of an entire district, employing thousands. Samuel's father had been a foreman there. Morrison's father had been the owner. The story the city remembered was a simple one: the mill had closed due to economic downturns. A tragedy, but an unavoidable one. The real story was far more complex. A knot of ethical dilemmas and hard choices that had left deep, invisible scars on both families. A quiet buzz from his phone interrupted his thoughts. The screen read, "James." He answered. "Dad, I saw the stream from the gala. Are you all right?" James's voice was calm, but Samuel could detect the underlying steel. His son had inherited his composure, but had forged it into a weapon in the corridors of national power. "I'm fine, son. It was just words." "Words are what he uses, Dad. He's been using them for years to reshape this city in his image. This time, he used them on you." James Washington was a name spoken with a mixture of awe and fear in Washington, D.C. As a senior official in the Justice Department, his influence was vast, but rarely visible. He operated in the shadows, a master of strategy and information. He loved his father fiercely and had offered him protection many times, an offer Samuel had always politely refused. "I can handle Bradley Morrison," Samuel said, the old soldier in him bristling at the thought of needing his son to fight his battles. "I know you can," James replied, his tone softening. But you don't have to do it alone. Morrison isn't just a bully. He's a system. He has judges in his pocket, city council members on his payroll. His real estate empire, Morrison Development, is a web of shell corporations and political favors. He presents himself as the city's savior, building gleaming condos and high-end retail. But he does it by pushing out small businesses and long-term residents. He uses legal loopholes and zoning variances to bleed communities dry, then buys up the land for pennies on the dollar. He's not building a city. He's curating a portfolio. Samuel listened, looking at a framed photograph on his desk. It was of a group of men in dusty work clothes, standing proudly in front of the old Northwood Mill. His father was in the front row. Morrison's father, a grim-faced man in a suit, stood off to the side. "He's doing more than that, isn't he?" Samuel asked, a cold certainty dawning on him. "This isn't just about business." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "No, it's not," James admitted. "For the last year, we've been tracking a pattern of what we're calling economic disenfranchisement in several cities. It's a quiet, insidious form of corruption. Morrison is a pioneer. He targets neighborhoods with historical significance to minority communities, systematically devalues them, and then rebrands them as luxury districts, erasing their cultural identity. The gala wasn't just a personal attack, Dad. It was a strategic move. By questioning your integrity, the integrity of a beloved black philanthropist, he's undermining the very idea of black legacy in this city. He's telling everyone that your history, our history, is built on something shameful and is therefore disposable. The pieces clicked into place. The public shaming, the subtle references to the past, it was all part of a larger, colder calculus. Morrison wasn't just settling an old score. He was clearing the path for his vision of the future. A future in which people like Samuel Washington and the communities he represented had no place. "What do you need me to do?" Samuel asked, his voice now devoid of any paternal pride. It was the voice of a man preparing for a campaign. "For now, nothing," James said. "Just live your life. Let him make the next move. He's arrogant. He thinks he's won. He'll overplay his hand." Samuel knew his son was right. This was a chess match, and the opening move had been made. His response had to be patient, precise, and utterly devastating. The battle for his dignity had just become a battle for the soul of his city. Morrison, drunk on the success of his public coup, did not wait long to escalate. The next move was not a whisper campaign or another veiled insult. It was a direct, brutal assault on Samuel's life's work. 2 weeks after the gala, a bright orange notice was plastered on the front door of the Marcus Garvey Youth Center, the first community project Samuel had ever founded. It was an eviction notice. The official reason, cited in dense, impenetrable legalese, was a series of zoning violations and a sudden, retroactive property tax reassessment that had inflated the center's dues by an impossible 500%. The building, which Samuel's foundation owned outright, was suddenly deemed to be in arrears to the tune of $250,000, payable in 30 days. Samuel stood before the notice, the garish orange a slash of violence against the dignified brick facade. He could feel Morrison's fingerprints all over it. The city's zoning board was chaired by a man who sat on the board of Morrison Development. The tax assessor's office had recently received a generous civic grant from one of Morrison's charitable fronts. It was a perfectly legal, perfectly corrupt checkmate. He knew he couldn't let the center fall. It was more than a building. It was a sanctuary. It was where children from the city's toughest neighborhoods came for tutoring, for sports, for a hot meal, for a safe place to simply be children. To lose it would be to lose a piece of his soul. It was a blow aimed not at his finances, but at his legacy. Morrison wasn't just trying to humiliate him. He was trying to erase him. This was the inciting incident, the move that transformed a defensive honor into an offensive campaign. The old soldier in him took over. The first step in any campaign is reconnaissance. He called Arthur Hemmings, his oldest friend and a retired corporate lawyer, whose mind was still as sharp as a shard of glass. "It's a classic squeeze play, Sam," Arthur said after reviewing the documents in Samuel's study. The two men sat opposite each other, a chessboard between them, a game that had been ongoing for 40 years. The paperwork is ironclad. They've used every loophole in the city code, on paper. This is a legitimate, if aggressive, municipal action. In reality, it's a targeted assassination. "So, we fight it in court," Samuel said, his voice firm. Arthur sighed, moving a pawn forward. "We can try. But the judge who will hear the preliminary injunction is Judge Albright. His daughter got a very generous scholarship to Georgetown last year, funded by the Morrison Family Foundation. The city attorney's office, which will defend the assessment, has 3 former Morrison development lawyers on its senior staff. We're not walking into a courtroom, Sam. We're walking into an ambush." Arthur's words were a cold dose of reality. Morrison's system was flawless. It was designed to crush opposition with the full, impartial weight of a law he himself had bought and paid for. Samuel felt a flicker of despair, the first he had allowed himself to feel. The fight seemed impossible, the enemy too entrenched, his influence too absolute. He moved his knight, a silent, thoughtful gesture. "So we don't fight him in his arena." "What other arena is there?" Arthur asked. Samuel looked up from the board, his eyes holding a new, hard light. "The one he doesn't know I have access to." That evening, he made a second call to his son. He didn't ask for help. He stated his intention. "James, I need information. I need to know where all the bodies are buried. I need a map of Morrison's empire, every shell corporation, every political favor, every ounce of leverage he has. I'm not asking you to fight this for me. I'm asking you to give me the weapons to fight it myself." There was a moment of silence. Then, James's voice, low and serious. "The file is encrypted. I'll send you the key. Be careful. Dad, you're not just taking on a man. You're taking on the machine he built." "I've taken on machines before," Samuel said, looking at the Purple Heart that lay in a velvet box on his mantelpiece. "I know how to find the gears that make them run." The decision was made. He would not be a victim. He would be a hunter. The first obstacle was not a wall, but a labyrinth of polite, bureaucratic indifference, guided by Arthur Hemmings. Samuel made his first official move. They filed a formal appeal with the City Planning Commission, challenging the zoning violations. The response was a form letter, arriving 2 weeks later, stating that their appeal was under review and a hearing would be scheduled in due course. It was a classic delay tactic, designed to run out the clock on the 30-day eviction notice. Next, they went to the press. Samuel contacted Sarah Jenkins, a well-respected, old-school investigative reporter at the city's largest newspaper. He laid out the story, the suspicious timing, the clear conflict of interest. Sarah was sympathetic, but her hands were tied. "Sam, I believe you," she said over coffee in a quiet diner, her voice laced with frustration. "But my editor won't run it. Morrison Development is the single largest advertiser in this paper. He pulls his ads. We have to lay off 20 people. It's that simple. He owns the narrative. All I can get published is a human interest piece about the good work the youth center does. No mention of Morrison. No hint of corruption." It was another dead end. Morrison's influence wasn't just political, it was economic. He controlled not only the levers of power, but also the platforms that were supposed to hold that power accountable. Defeated, but not broken, Samuel made his final conventional attempt. He scheduled a meeting with his city councilwoman, a charismatic young woman he had supported, who had built her platform on promises of community advocacy. She greeted him with a warm smile and a firm handshake in her sterile City Hall office. But as Samuel explained the situation, her expression grew guarded. "This is a very serious allegation. Mr. Washington," she said, her words carefully chosen. "But the tax assessor's office is an independent body. My hands are tied. Intervening could be seen as political overreach." "It's not overreach to ask for a fair review," Samuel countered, keeping his voice even. "The assessment is punitive and clearly retaliatory." "I understand your perspective," she said, the smile never reaching her eyes. "Let me see what I can do." It was the gentle, practiced kiss of death of a politician trapped between her conscience and her career. Samuel knew she would do nothing. A week later, he saw a photo of her cutting a ribbon at the opening of a new Morrison Development luxury apartment complex, smiling brightly by Bradley Morrison's side. The system was sealed shut. Every door he knocked on was answered by one of Morrison's gatekeepers. Every official channel was a tributary that flowed back into Morrison's ocean of influence. It was a suffocating, dispiriting realization. He was a citizen with a legitimate grievance, a man of impeccable standing, and he was utterly powerless. The machine his son had warned him about was not just efficient, it was impenetrable. Sitting in his study late one night, surrounded by the evidence of his failures, the form letter, the toothless newspaper article, the memory of a politician's empty promise, Samuel felt the true weight of his opponent's power. He understood now that he could not dismantle the machine from the outside. He would have to find a way inside, to find the hidden flaw, the single loose wire that could cause the entire corrupt edifice to collapse. The time for playing by the established rules was over. The war would now be fought in the shadows. The transition from defense to offense began in Samuel's quiet study, which was transformed into a covert war room. The chessboard was pushed aside, replaced by a large corkboard. The first piece of intelligence, delivered via James's encrypted file, was a comprehensive map of Morrison's corporate empire. It was a dizzying web of LLCs, holding companies, and offshore accounts, designed to obscure ownership and liability. "He's a ghost," Arthur muttered, tracing the complex lines with his finger. "His name is barely on anything directly. It's brilliant, and it's diabolical." Samuel knew they couldn't fight this alone. He needed a team. James had provided the map, and Arthur was his strategist. Now he needed a scout, someone who could navigate the terrain. He thought of Elena Reyes, a young, hungry freelance journalist who ran a small but influential investigative blog. She was a digital native, fearless and unconstrained by the corporate pressures that had neutered Sarah Jenkins. He had mentored her years ago, and he knew she possessed a righteous fury against injustice. He met her in a small park, far from any listening devices. He laid out the situation, holding nothing back, her eyes, dark and intelligent, lit up with a familiar fire. "They told me I was a conspiracy theorist when I started digging into Morrison's zoning variances last year," she said, a grim smile on her face. "They tried to ruin my credibility. I'd love nothing more than to help you burn his kingdom to the ground." Elena became their operative. She began to dig, using her network of sources, her skills in data mining, and her sheer tenacity to follow the money. While Arthur analyzed legal structures, Elena traced the flow of cash. It was a slow, painstaking process. Morrison had covered his tracks well. Their first small victory came from an unexpected quarter. Elena uncovered a pattern of exorbitant consulting fees paid by Morrison Development to a small, obscure firm. The firm's sole proprietor was the brother-in-law of Judge Albright, the very judge set to hear the youth center's case. It was the smoking gun for the judicial conflict of interest, enough to force Albright to recuse himself. It didn't save the center. The case was simply reassigned to another judge, likely just as compromised, but it was a message to Morrison. We see you. Morrison's retaliation was swift and brutal. He didn't come after Samuel directly. He came after his team. An anonymous tip was sent to the IRS about Arthur Hemming's pension, triggering a grueling and invasive audit designed to drown him in paperwork and legal fees. Simultaneously, a vicious smear campaign was launched against Elena. Doctored photos and fabricated stories appeared on shady political websites, accusing her of plagiarism and ethical breaches, threatening her freelance career. The threats became more personal. One evening, Samuel found the tires of his car slashed. A dead bird was left on Elena's doorstep. Arthur's mail was stolen. These were not the actions of a sophisticated tycoon. They were the thuggish tactics of a cornered animal. Morrison was feeling the pressure, and he was lashing out. "He's trying to isolate you." "Sam," Arthur said, his voice weary but resolute during one of their late-night strategy sessions. "He wants to make this so costly for us that we have no choice but to back down." But the attacks had the opposite effect. They solidified the team's resolve. James, monitoring the situation from a distance, provided a crucial piece of support. He connected Elena with a top-tier cybersecurity firm that worked pro bono for journalists under threat. They scrubbed her digital footprint, traced the smear campaign back to a PR firm secretly owned by a Morrison shell company, and fed the information back to Elena for a future exposé. The fight was taking its toll. The eviction date for the youth center loomed, a ticking clock that added a desperate urgency to their work. They were gathering pieces of a puzzle, but the full picture remained elusive. They had evidence of cronyism, of political influence, of intimidation. But they lacked the one thing that could bring it all crashing down. Morrison's motive. Why this relentless, personal crusade against Samuel? The answer, Samuel suspected, lay buried in the past, in the ashes of the Northwood Mill. He asked Elena to shift her focus, to stop looking at Morrison's present and start digging into his family's past. The breakthrough came not from a financial ledger or a leaked email, but from a dusty, forgotten box in the city archives. Elena, following Samuel's hunch, had filed a broad public records request for all documents related to the Northwood Mill's closure in 1982. After weeks of bureaucratic stonewalling, a junior clerk, a young man whose grandfather had worked at the mill, quietly slipped her a folder marked Miscellaneous Correspondence. Inside was a series of letters between the city's Economic Development Council and Thomas Morrison, Bradley's father. The official story was that the mill had closed due to foreign competition. The letters told a different story. The city had offered Thomas Morrison a generous bailout package, contingent on modernizing the mill's aging equipment to meet new environmental standards. It would have saved the mill and over 2,000 jobs. Thomas Morrison had refused the deal. But why the answer was in the margins of a financial statement. In a handwritten note, Elena almost missed. It referenced a pending insurance claim for an amount 5 times the value of the city's bailout. "He planned to burn it down," Samuel said, his voice a low whisper as he stared at the document spread across his dining table. The pieces were falling into place with a horrifying clarity. "It gets worse," Elena said, pushing another file across the table. It was a fire marshal's report, dated 3 weeks after the bailout was refused. A massive fire had gutted the Northwood Mill. The cause was officially listed as undetermined, likely faulty wiring. But a supplementary report, never released to the public, detailed evidence of accelerants found in 3 separate locations. It was arson. The final piece of the puzzle was a thin, crisp document, a copy of the insurance payout check. Thomas Morrison had walked away from the ashes of his family's legacy with a check for $20 million. It was seed money that his son, Bradley, would later use to found Morrison Development. Their entire empire was built on a foundation of insurance fraud and the ruin of 2,000 families. But Samuel's role in this was still unclear. "Where do I fit in?" he asked. Arthur, who had been quietly cross-referencing dates, looked up from his laptop, his face pale. "Oh, Sam," he said softly. "You were the alibi." He turned the screen toward Samuel. It showed a newspaper article from the week of the fire. The headline read, "Local Businessman Honored for Civic Duty." The article detailed how Samuel Washington, then a rising young executive at a downtown bank, had organized a last-ditch community effort to save the mill. He had chaired a series of late-night meetings with union leaders and city officials, desperately trying to broker a new deal. "Look at the date and time of the final meeting," Arthur instructed. It had taken place on the night of the fire. At the exact time, the arson investigators believed the blaze had been set. And who was the key witness who vouched for Thomas Morrison's whereabouts that night, claiming he was at home, distraught over the mill's imminent failure? Samuel read the name, and the air left his lungs. The witness was a young Bradley Morrison. "But that's not all," Arthur continued, his voice heavy with the weight of the discovery. "Your final meeting was with the union. Thomas Morrison had been fighting them for months, refusing to negotiate a new contract. According to the insurance policy, if the mill's closure was due to a labor dispute, the payout would be significantly less. But if it was a no-fault act of God, like an accidental fire..." The full, monstrous truth settled over the room. Thomas Morrison had used Samuel's well-intentioned, public efforts to save the mill had created the perfect cover. By engaging the union, Samuel had inadvertently created a narrative of labor strife, which Thomas Morrison could have used as a backup if the arson was discovered. But more importantly, Samuel's heroic public stance made him an unimpeachable character witness to the community's desperation. No one would ever suspect the owner would destroy his own mill when a good man like Samuel Washington was fighting so hard to save it. Bradley Morrison had not just witnessed this. He had been a party to it. He had lied to protect his father. He had watched as his family's fortune was built on the suffering of their neighbors, all while Samuel was being hailed as a local hero for his failed efforts. The vendetta was suddenly crystal clear. It wasn't just about business or racism. It was a deeply personal, twisted form of revenge, in Bradley Morrison's warped perception. Samuel was not a hero. He was the man who had received the community's praise while the Morrisons took the fall. The man whose unimpeachable goodness had served as the perfect cover for their crime. Every good deed Samuel performed, every award he received, was another turn of the knife in Morrison's psyche. He didn't just want to ruin Samuel. He wanted to tear down the entire edifice of his honor, to prove that the sainted Samuel Washington was a fraud, just like his own father. The fight was no longer about a youth center or a zoning dispute. It was about the truth of a 50-year-old wound that had never healed. Samuel looked at the faces of his friends, his allies. The weight of the past and the threat of the future settled upon him. He now had the weapon that could destroy Bradley Morrison. But he knew, with a chilling certainty, that Morrison would not go down without a final, desperate battle. Morrison must have sensed the shift in the ether, the tightening of the net. Perhaps one of his sources in the city archives warned him about Elena's research. Or perhaps his paranoia, simply detected the change in Samuel's strategy from passive resistance to active hunting. His response was not one of retreat, but of overwhelming, preemptive force. He unleashed his most devastating attack, aimed not at Samuel's legacy, but at his very freedom. It began with a knock on the door at dawn. Two stern-faced detectives from the city's economic crimes unit stood on Samuel's doorstep, a warrant in hand. They were polite, professional, and utterly implacable. They were there to search the premises in connection with an ongoing investigation into financial fraud. Samuel watched in stunned silence as they methodically went through his study, boxing up his financial records, his computer, his files. The warrant was vague, referencing irregularities in the Foundation's accounting, but Samuel knew this was Morrison's handiwork. An hour later, Elena called, her voice tight with panic. "Sam, they're here. The DA's office. They're seizing all my research, my hard drives, everything. They have a warrant that names me as a co-conspirator in a scheme to defame a public citizen, Bradley Morrison." The strategy was brutally effective. Morrison was using the power of the state to legally confiscate all the evidence they had gathered against him. It was a masterful countermove, turning their own investigation into the basis for a criminal prosecution against them. The final blow landed on Arthur. A formal complaint was filed with the State Bar Association, accusing him of witness tampering and unethical conduct, citing his informal advice to Samuel. His license to practice law, even in retirement, was now in jeopardy. In less than 24 hours, Morrison had decapitated their operation. Their evidence was seized, their communications compromised, and their legal counsel neutralized. They were isolated and on the defensive, thrown into a legal quagmire designed to bankrupt them and destroy their reputations before they could ever bring the truth about the Northwood Mill to light. The centerpiece of Morrison's attack was a series of expertly forged documents that had been anonymously leaked to the district attorney. They appeared to be emails between Samuel and a disgruntled former accountant from Morrison Development, conspiring to fabricate evidence of financial misconduct. The forgeries were brilliant, incorporating details of Samuel's life and writing style that made them chillingly plausible. Morrison was not just framing Samuel. He was using the truth of Samuel's investigation to build the architecture of a lie. Samuel found himself in a nightmare inversion of reality. He was being accused of the very crimes he sought to expose, by the very man who had committed them. The city's legal system, the institution he had been taught to respect, was being wielded as a weapon against him. His reputation, built over a lifetime of careful, honorable conduct, was being systematically dismantled. The local news, citing the ongoing investigation, ran a story with the headline, "Philanthropist's Foundation Under Scrutiny for Financial Improprieties." He was losing. The machine was too big, too powerful. Morrison had anticipated their every move and had turned their strengths, their commitment to the truth, their reliance on evidence into weaknesses. Desperate, Samuel made the call he had sworn he would never make. He asked his son for direct intervention. "I can't, Dad," James said, his voice strained with an anguish that tore at Samuel's heart. "If I interfere, if I use my federal position to quash a local investigation, it will validate every accusation they're making. It will look like a cover-up. Morrison is counting on me to do exactly that. It's a trap. It would destroy my career and, worse, it would make you look guilty. I'm sorry. You're on your own for this." The line went quiet. Samuel stood in his ransacked study, the silence of the room pressing in on him. He had never felt so completely and utterly alone. His allies were under attack, his evidence was gone, and his last resort was denied to him. Morrison had finally succeeded in isolating him. The fight seemed over. All that was left was the slow, public execution of his name. But in that moment of absolute despair, the old soldier in him found one last reserve of strength. Morrison had made one critical error. He had taken everything from Samuel, and in doing so, had left him with nothing left to lose. The clock was ticking. The eviction of the youth center was days away, and the grand jury was being convened to review the fraudulent charges against him. Samuel was trapped, but Morrison's attack, designed to be the final, crushing blow, had an unintended consequence. In seizing Elena's research, the DA's office had inadvertently taken possession of the evidence of Morrison's crimes. The key to his destruction was now sitting in an evidence locker downtown. They just had to find a way to get it out and present it to a court that Morrison didn't own. The idea came from Arthur, his legal mind finding a loophole even under the threat of disbarment. We can't fight him in a criminal court. And we can't fight him in the press, Arthur explained. The three of them huddled in a booth at a noisy 24-hour diner, the only place they felt safe to talk. So we have to create a new front. We take the fight to his home turf, the corporate world. Morrison Development was a publicly traded company. Bradley Morrison was the CEO and chairman, but he was still accountable to a board of directors and, ultimately, to his shareholders. We can't force a criminal prosecutor to listen, Arthur said, his eyes gleaming with a strategic fire. But we can force a board of directors to listen to something that threatens their stock price. We file a shareholder derivative lawsuit. The plan was audacious. They would accuse the board of directors of gross negligence for allowing their CEO, Bradley Morrison, to expose the company to massive legal and financial risk through his personal vendetta and corrupt activities. This civil action would give them the power of discovery, the legal right to demand documents and depose witnesses. It would force the DA's office to hand over the evidence they had seized from Elena. But who will file it? Samuel asked. None of us are shareholders. Elena smiled for the first time in days. I am, she said, pulling up a brokerage statement on her phone. Last year, when I was first investigating him, I bought one share of Morrison Development stock. I wanted to have access to the annual shareholder reports. It cost me $47. That single share of stock was the key. It was their way back into the fight. While Arthur drafted the lawsuit, Elena, with the help of James's cybersecurity contacts, began a quiet campaign. They identified the largest institutional investors in Morrison Development pension funds, university endowments, investment banks. They created an anonymous, encrypted data drop containing a summary of their findings, the arson, the fraud, the political corruption, and sent it to the risk management departments of these institutions. They didn't leak it to the public, but to the people whose only concern was the bottom line. The response was immediate. The stock price of Morrison Development, which had been stable for years, began to wobble. Quiet inquiries were made. The board of directors, who had previously ignored Morrison's activities, were suddenly facing pressure from their most powerful investors. They could no longer dismiss the allegations as a personal dispute. An emergency shareholders meeting was called to address the growing concerns about executive conduct. The climax was set. It would not be in a criminal court, but in the glass-walled boardroom on the top floor of the Morrison Tower. The confrontation would be live-streamed to all shareholders. It was a make-or-break public forum with immediate, irreversible consequences. As the day of the meeting approached, a storm began to gather over the city, the sky turning a bruised purple-gray. The weather mirrored the tempest brewing inside the tower. Samuel prepared meticulously. He would not be presenting a case for his own innocence. He would be presenting a case for the soul of the company and the city it claimed to serve. He walked into the boardroom, flanked by Arthur and Elena. The room was cold. The long mahogany table a polished abyss. The board members sat stiffly, their faces grim. At the head of the table sat Bradley Morrison, his charismatic smile looking strained, like a mask about to crack. Outside, the storm broke. Rain lashed against the panoramic windows, and a low rumble of thunder echoed in the distance, a fitting soundtrack for the battle to come. "Mr. Washington," the lead director said, his voice tight, "the board has reviewed the preliminary materials. We find these allegations disturbing. You have the floor." Samuel stood. He did not raise his voice. He did not gesture wildly. He spoke with the quiet, devastating calm of a man who possessed the absolute truth. He laid out the story, not of his own grievance, but of a 50-year deception. He presented the evidence they had legally obtained through discovery, the fire marshal's report, the insurance payout, the letters proving Thomas Morrison's fraud. He connected it directly to Bradley Morrison's decades-long campaign of corruption, using city records and financial statements to show how the profits from that first crime had funded the systemic disenfranchisement of the city's most vulnerable communities. The board was shaken. The investors watching the live stream were horrified. The stock ticker, visible on a screen in the corner, began to plummet. Morrison, seeing his empire crumbling, played his final, desperate card. He rose to his feet, his composure finally shattering, his voice raw with a lifetime of resentment. "He's not telling you the whole story," Morrison snarled, pointing a trembling finger at Samuel. "Ask him why the mill was in trouble in the first place. Ask him about the deal he made." He threw a folder onto the table. It contained documents from 1982, from Samuel's time at the bank. They showed that Samuel, in his capacity as a commercial loan officer, had been the one to recommend that the bank call in the mill's line of credit, a decision that had pushed the already struggling company to the brink of bankruptcy. "He presents himself as a hero who tried to save the mill." Morrison spat, his voice dripping with venom. "But he was the one who put the knife in. It was his correct, ethical decision, as a banker, that started the collapse. My father did what he had to do to save our family from the ruin this man initiated." It was a brilliant, venomous twist. It didn't absolve Morrison of his crimes, but it complicated Samuel's moral victory. It painted him not as a simple victim, but as a participant in the original tragedy. The board members looked at Samuel, their expressions now a mixture of confusion and suspicion. "And there's more," Morrison pressed. "Seeing his advantage, the evidence he's using, the financial records that prove my current business practices are inextricably linked to the mill workers' pension fund. We invested it aggressively to make up for the shortfalls from the 80s. If you force a full disclosure and liquidation of these assets to pay for his precious justice, the fund will collapse. 5,000 families, the very people he claims to champion, will lose everything, their life savings, gone. Is your revenge worth their ruin? Samuel, is it?" The room was silent, save for the drumming of the rain against the glass. The secondary twist was a masterstroke of cruelty. Morrison was holding the lives of 5,000 innocent people hostage. He had forced Samuel into an impossible choice: achieve total revenge and devastate the community, or back down and let Morrison win. It was a test not of evidence, but of character. Samuel stood in the eye of the storm, the weight of 1,000 lives on his shoulders. He looked at Bradley Morrison, a man hollowed out by a lifetime of hatred, and he felt not anger, but a profound sense of pity. Then, he looked at the board. "He is right," Samuel said, his voice clear and steady, cutting through the tension. "I did make that recommendation. It was the hardest decision of my professional life. The mill was failing, and my fiduciary duty to the bank was clear. It was a correct, ethical, and deeply painful decision. But he is also lying. Samuel turned to a screen and nodded to Elena. A final document appeared, one they had held in reserve. It was a sworn affidavit from the former comptroller of Northwood Mill, a man they had located living in quiet retirement in Arizona. Thomas Morrison had been siphoning money from the company for years, Samuel explained, his voice resonating with moral authority. He was cooking the books. The mill wasn't just failing, it was being deliberately bankrupted by its owner. My recommendation to call in the loan was not the cause of the collapse. It was a response to the fraud I had begun to uncover. A fraud that would have been fully exposed if not for the fire. He let that sink in. Then he addressed Morrison's final, desperate threat. As for the pension fund, Samuel said, turning to the board, you are correct. A full liquidation would be catastrophic, which is why that is not what I am asking for. I am asking for Mr. Morrison's immediate removal as CEO and chairman, and I am proposing that the company pay its debt to this city not through liquidation, but by placing the entirety of Mr. Morrison's personal assets and stock holdings into a trust, managed by an independent arbiter, to secure the pension fund in perpetuity and to fund the restoration of the communities his practices have harmed. Justice does not require the punishment of the innocent. It requires that the guilty pay their debt. It was the third way, a path that was not about revenge, but about restoration. It was a solution that was as elegant and precise as it was devastating. It stripped Morrison of his power and his wealth, but it protected the innocent and offered a path toward healing. The vote was a mere formality. Bradley Morrison was unanimously removed. His reign was over. He slumped into his chair, a defeated man, the storm outside a pale reflection of the one that had just consumed his life. Samuel Washington had not just won. He had proven his character, turning a weapon of revenge into an instrument of justice. The collapse of Bradley Morrison's empire was as swift as it was total. The emergency meeting acted as a catalyst, the revelations of his 50-year deceit sending shockwaves through the city's financial and political foundations. The live stream, intended for a few hundred shareholders, went viral, its key moments replayed endlessly on news channels and social media. Morrison became an overnight pariah, his name synonymous with a new, more insidious form of corporate evil. In the immediate aftermath, Samuel felt not the elation of victory, but the profound exhaustion of a soldier after a long and brutal war. He sat in his study with Arthur and Elena, the silence between them comfortable, born of shared struggle. The news on the television played on mute, showing images of Morrison being swarmed by reporters, his face a haggard mask of disbelief. "We did it," Elena said softly, breaking the silence. There was awe in her voice. "You did it," Samuel corrected her gently. "You and Arthur. I was merely the vessel for your courage." Arthur shook his head. "No, Sam. We were the tools. You were the architect. You never lost sight of what this was about. Not revenge. Justice." The fallout was messy. The U.S. Attorney's Office, embarrassed by the DA's complicity, launched a full-scale federal investigation into Morrison and the city's corruption. Indictments came down against Judge Albright, several city council members, and the DA himself. The machine was being dismantled, gear by rusty gear. The trust Samuel had proposed was established, with Arthur Hemmings appointed as one of its independent trustees. Morrison's vast personal fortune was seized, securing the Northwood Mill Pension Fund and creating a new, multi-million-dollar community redevelopment fund. The first official act of the trust was to pay the fraudulent tax bill on the Marcus Garvey Youth Center and grant it a permanent endowment. The eviction notice came down, replaced by a plaque honoring Samuel's perseverance. Yet, the victory felt complex. Samuel received letters and calls, some praising him as a hero, others from former Morrison Development employees who had lost their jobs in the company's restructuring, blaming him for their misfortune. He understood that even righteous wars have collateral damage. His confrontation with Morrison had saved a community, but had also disrupted lives, a truth he carried with a heavy heart. He had won the war, but the cost had been high, not just for his enemy, but for the entire city, which now had to grapple with the rot that had festered for so long beneath its polished surface. He felt the weight of his actions, the ethical and emotional toll of having to destroy a part of his city in order to save it. 6 months later, Samuel stood on a windswept patch of land overlooking the river. Before him were the skeletal remains of the Northwood Mill. The brick walls were crumbling, the windows were gaping voids, and nature was slowly reclaiming the land. It was a monument to shared trauma, a place of ghosts for him, for Bradley Morrison, and for thousands of families. But Samuel was not there to mourn the past. Beside him stood a young, ambitious architect, her tablet displaying not a wrecking ball, but a blueprint for rebirth. He had used a portion of his own settlement from the lawsuit to purchase the derelict site from the city. "The main structure is sound," the architect was saying, her voice full of excitement. "We can preserve the original facade, honor the history, but inside, we can build it new. The vocational school will be on the ground floor. Here, classrooms for carpentry, electrical work, coding, on the second floor. The business incubator for local startups. And the top floor, a community art gallery and performance space." Samuel looked at the plans, then back at the ruin. He saw not what was, but what could be. He saw a place where the grandchildren of the men who had lost their jobs at the mill could learn the skills for a new economy. He saw a place where the cycle of ruin and resentment could be broken, transformed into a cycle of opportunity and creation. It would be called the Northwood Center for Opportunity, a name that looked forward, not back. He had broken the cycle of revenge. His victory over Morrison had not ended with his enemy's destruction, but with the deliberate, thoughtful construction of something new from the wreckage of their shared history. He was using his power, not to punish, but to build. It was the final, defining act of his character, a testament to the truth he had held onto throughout the entire ordeal, that true strength is not the power to tear down, but the courage to build up. He had restored his own dignity, and now he would help restore the dignity of the community that both he and his adversary had once called home. He gave the architect a nod of approval, a quiet smile gracing his lips. The wind picked up, carrying the sounds of the city, a place of new beginnings, of second chances, a place he had fought for, a place he had helped to heal.